And of course, then I was suddenly called a conspiracy theorist, spreader of misinformation, all kinds of things. And from that point on, my kind of that research career was dead because I was basically censored, cancelled completely. And I was treated like an academic pariah. There is such unbelievable inefficiencies, and this whole infrastructure, this whole human resources infrastructure, this whole DI infrastructure, which is sucking the life out of, which is sucking in so many, increasingly, so many of these resources, and these useless, of course, ridiculous courses, which are actually people don't really want. Well, the problem there is, and this is a continuing problem as well, it's not easily going to go away, is because of the whole repopulation taking place in the UK, and we're much worse affected by this than the US, of course. The Muslims, right? Although they had a bit of this is going to create a little bit of a problem for them because, of course, at the last election, there were 5 independent MPs got in. We call them the Gaza MPs because they stood solely on the platform that Labour wasn't sufficiently anti-Israel.
Welcome, everybody. I'm honored today to have Professor Norman Fenton. He's Professor Emeritus. Oftentimes we say emeritus here. I don't know. You tell us the distinction. But
I don't know how to pronounce it properly. So
yeah. So it certainly has the word merit in the middle there. And Norman Fenton, if anybody I know amongst the professorial class, deserves merit. He is a one-man meritocracy himself. He's a brilliant guy, polymath. And with the emphasis, I guess, on the math part, because that's his general field of expertise. I'm not sure about the poly part, but his interests run far afield, and we're going to talk kind of like I guess the inversion of mathematics, social science, and how things are playing out in the UK and the world in general. Because Norman has thoughts on those things. So Norman, tell us what's been going on with you. What are your interests, and where are the kind of landmines societally?
Well, I guess it just should make clear to everyone who doesn't know me that I did have a fairly prestigious career as an academic, and I was regarded as kind of like a leading expert in the use of a thing called Bayesian methods of risk assessment. But that all changed in 2020 when I started to talk about how the entire COVID narrative was being driven by flawed and easily manipulated statistics. And of course, then I was suddenly called a conspiracy theorist, spreader of misinformation, all kinds of things. And from that point on, my kind of that research career was dead because I was basically censored, cancelled completely. And I was treated like an academic pariah. Now, I was always aware of the total corruption of academia. Right, this has been a growing thing all along. So I wasn't surprised that this happened. It was already happening. I'd already experienced it a bit because I'd come out against the sort of the climate change narrative to a certain extent as well. And so I knew how corrupt and dysfunctional academia was. And because there's a new party in the UK called Advance UK. It's run by a guy called Ben Habib, who maybe people in the States don't know, but actually Elon Musk is a big fan of Ben Habib, and he'd really been promoting Ben Habib. In fact, Ben Habib was the only politician who spoke at the big Unite the Kingdom rally, which attracted over 1 million people in a few weeks ago, where Elon Musk actually conducted an 18-minute interview live with, obviously via Zoom or whatever, with Tommy Robinson. It was Tommy Robinson who'd arranged this. And Ben Habib seems to be the only, although Nigel Farage with his Reform UK are easily now leading all the opinion polls, etc. There's a lot of people feel that Farage is just a slight extension of the sort of the uniparty, and he isn't really getting to sort of the issues which concern most people. So Ben Habib, with this, started this new party, Advance UK. It's now got over 30,000 paid up signed members, which was the threshold at which it was going to be registered as a political party. And that's happening. That's in the process of happening. And he was looking for members of what's called a college. It's also democratically elected. So I had to go through his process. And I was approached by him to be on this. And I'm actually not a political person as such, right? But I thought, you know what? There's something I can offer here, right? I can actually I feel that because I feel that one of the most critical challenges are the capture. The critical challenges to the UK is the fact that all of the key institutions of state, be it legal, political, education, media, they've all been captured by far left activists who come indoctrinated from universities. And this has been going on for years. This is essentially, what we call the long march, the cultural Marxist long march through the institutions. So you get this, they come out, they go into these, into these institutions. They go into education. They educate the next generation, of course, not just of university students, but school kids. Even now infants, they're indoctrinating with this woke ideology. And it seems to me that this is at the root of all of the problems, that we're seeing today. So basically, all of the problems of society, and especially in the UK, that we're seeing. So whether it be, the two-tier justice system, which I can talk about, the whole censorship, the climate catastrophe narrative, ridiculous with its net zero programs, destruction of traditional family values, obsession with this diversity, equity, inclusion over competence, all the woke ideology, population replacement, all of these things come from that indoctrination from the universities. That's how it's continually manufactured. It's continually, it's always there. It's this continual brainwashing, and it affects everybody in the end. And so I felt that I've got about over 45 years of experience in that academic system. And I know both how it works and the depth of depravity and corruption that most of the public are completely unaware of. And I also feel that it can be reformed. There are ways to tackle this. There are quite radical ways to tackle it. And so at least I can raise much more public awareness of these problems and maybe even have some input into some solutions.
Well, you have my vote. I'm not sure I'm registered in one of your districts, but it's
probably have to be a UK resident to be a member.
Well, I don't see why mere legality should stand in the way. It oftentimes hasn't here. We're finding a lot of people with CDLs, which are commercial driver licenses, with these things that says no name given. They're just, California, New York State, other places are just handing these things out, and the license literally says no name given to illegal aliens so they could ride the roads. That's not the same as voting, but it's kind of the entry drug for voting. And we've certainly seen, I think it was an illegal alien who's the head of some of the Iowa schools, believe it or not, from Jamaica, Caribbean, and not only is he illegal, but he's registered to vote in a couple different places. So this does bleed over. I don't see why I should be excluded from the UK system. I do speak English, and coincident with the word England. Anyway, I'm just teasing. But
join up. You missed the threshold though for the £10 membership. It's gone up to £20 now because I've gone over the threshold. So you've got a double amount.
So you bring up a lot of interesting topics. I think the march through the institutions. As you were talking, I was thinking of the standard horror movie. I don't know if you've watched any horror movies. I mostly stay away from them because I have such a delicate mind. But I've seen my fair share of them. My younger son is a screenwriter, and he sat me through a whole bunch of them while he was going through his phase. And I think the standard trope is, you get rid of the enemy, the monster, whatever, and everyone's kind of sitting on the back porch or the front porch, whatever, and smoking a cig and hanging out and talking about everything, and then boom, and the thing comes back again. It's that boom, that pound that comes at you. And I feel like there was I forget which quasi historian wrote The End of History. During the when the I guess the Clinton era here, and probably Tony Blair there, where the Soviet Union had been defeated, the wall came down, everything was, communism was dead, the wicked witch is dead, all that kind of stuff, and everyone kind of relaxed. It's the end of history, and we can go on to doing I don't know what, just tilling our gardens and hanging out in the sun and singing songs and so forth. But this seems to be the second act of the horror movie, that this corruption of the institutions, the things that you rely on. I mean, there are many examples. I go golfing from time to time, or I think I am golfing. I'm doing something out there, and there are these. One year there's a big tree, and the next year it's on the ground, and you see the whole center part of it has been hollowed out. That termites or some other bug has been at it, and then the I don't know, various birds, whatever. The birds may open the door, and then the bugs get in, other animals, and they've been having their party inside that tree, which looked like a tree for so long, and you think it's so sturdy and foundational, whatever, and then it's just gone. It's just been a hollowed out shell of itself. And I think COVID and all this other stuff that's happening now through Europe with this kind of favoring immigrants over natural born hereditary individuals of those countries. The place has just been hollowed out. So that's kind of the march of the institution, and that's kind of the second act, or closing act of the horror movie. Who wins? How do we get back to sitting on the porch and just kind of pondering, quote unquote, the end of history?
Yeah, and the problem is, as I was saying, with academia, because unless you get to the root of the problem, which I say is academia, and in particular the universities, that monster is going to keep coming back. You might think you've got rid of it in this generation, but unless you get to the root of it, unless you root it out completely from the universities, nothing's going to happen. I mean, if you want to know I can tell you what my ideas. I mean, where does the corruption start from? I mean, partly it's the funding, isn't it? I mean, in the UK, as in the US, students are now charged quite significant fees to come, and that really should be enough. The fees they pay should easily be enough to give those students not only a very good quality education, but also for the university to carry out high quality research. The fees are enormous, right? But there's such incredible, there is such unbelievable inefficiencies. And this whole infrastructure, this whole human resources infrastructure, this whole DI infrastructure, which is sucking the life out of, which is sucking in so many of these resources, and these useless, of course, ridiculous courses, which are actually people don't really want, or they've been told they want them. They're easy, and so people think they'll go into them. Well, you wouldn't have if you had to rely only on student fees and not on any government funding, and that includes both UK, in our case, UK government and foreign government funding, which are the two main corrupting sources. If you take away that funding, you solve the problem, because they'll be forced to just deliver the high quality education on the fees they get in, and that would necessarily involve cutting all of the, essentially, the cultural Marxism, which is makes up the 90% of the useless fluff, but which creates the indoctrination. You just get rid of it. That's it. I mean, in the UK, you've got the same problem in America. You can't just say get rid of all UK government funding, which is massive. It's massive. They fund not just, most of the teaching, massive amounts of teaching, and of course, virtually all of the research. But why? If you just sit down and take any case study of any individual university, you could see that they could survive very, very well without all the nonsense and rubbish courses, just on the fees. They don't need any of that money. But, people will never never tackle this. And let's say the foreign funding, the UK, we've got a big, big problem with Chinese and Arab funding. Qatar, in particular, major problem, but China, mega problem. They've completely subverted so many of the courses and taken over entire departments, in many cases useless departments. Like, I mean, of course, Qatar funds all of these anti-Israel Middle East studies departments, which is, exponentially increasing everywhere. Everyone's got one now. You've got to have it, But China actually funds many of they actually control much of what goes into even things like AI teaching, for example. People have got no idea the extent to which there's this massive foreign government interference, which is all perpetuates these same cultural Marxist globalist ideologies.
No, you're absolutely right there. I wrote a blog post a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. I called it Chat CCP, and I didn't have a Substack of my own back then, and somebody did publish it, and but a lot of people wouldn't, and it's basically the fact that the LLMs, they're large language models. It depends on what you're looking at, and at a certain point, as a mathematician, I think you'll appreciate that it has this iterative effect. If it favors a certain type of thing, and then you keep pouring more of that thing in, it's a kind of a dilution aspect, or a reverse dilution. So, the more you kind of pull out the blue ping pong balls, and the more you add red ones, the room looks more red, and then you assume that's what it is, and then you keep adding more red because that's what you see. I don't know if that's a good example, but if everything you listen to is says X, then you get more of that, and then because of the way the internet works, you're just coming up with more articles that are just kind of self-propagating.
Exactly. Look, I'll give you a very, very concrete example, which I've got intimate knowledge. Right. I don't know if you've ever heard of a thing called the Alan Turing Institute.
Yeah.
This was a government-funded institute in beautiful offices within the British Library, down at the new British Library at King's Cross. They set it up, I think in 2015 or 2016. I can't remember exactly when. Massive government funding, right? And it's supposed to be the UK's centre for AI research, essentially. Okay, and in addition to major funded projects, they funded quite a few Turing Fellows, of which I was one. In fact, I was from Queen Mary, where I was, because obviously I was working in the area of, you could call it AI, Bayesian methods. Of course, it is a sort of an AI type method. So it was inevitable, and also given my research record, that I would be asked to sort of, apply and join that. And I actually ended up being one of the coordinators of the Turing Institute and Queen Mary. And I was like, my fellowship gave me not only some project funding, but a little bit of project funding, but also like bought me out for, I don't know, half a day a week or something like that, the time I was there. So I got to look at this institute from the inside and find out what was going on there. And I can tell you that virtually all of the funding for that so-called AI research, there were a few small exceptions, but what completely dominated it was funding which was essentially dedicated to finding clever algorithms to censor or ridicule people like us based on what far leftists define as misinformation. So you had the kind of like the social scientists who are sort of considered to be the sort of the quasi-AI people. They're the ones in there defining what constitutes misinformation, right? And then you've got the real AI computer geeks basically coding algorithms, very, very clever algorithms, to make sure that narrative was the one which was determined what was correct and what was not correct, what was misinformation and what was not misinformation. That's it. That is what, and I can tell you, it's not even just at the Turing Institute. This is virtually all UK government AI research is dedicated to basically clever censorship algorithms. And that's why they're so rigorous. Why they are actually so incredibly good at the moment, the UK government, in automatically finding, someone sends out, like, you know, a guy sends out a meme which is criticizing Hamas. Well, that's not allowed. That's not an allowed narrative, because in UK, for the UK government now, Hamas is good. You can't criticize them. It's that bad. So a guy puts out a meme criticizing Hamas, go and arrest him in the middle of the night. It's happening all over. We've got, like, I think we've now got something like, we've had 12,000 arrests this year just for people posting, spicy memes on the internet. This is where we're at now. As it so happens, so as far as me and the Turing Institute is concerned, it's quite interesting, because I was, let's just say, ruffling a few feathers, especially then, of course, I was there as a fellow when, of course, the whole COVID thing started, and of course, the big thing, what everybody was focused on in 2020 and 2021 was basically censoring any misinformation about COVID, or the fact that the vaccines might not be this fantastically safe and effective solution to the problem. So that all these seminars, people showing how they got all these clever algorithms to weed out all this misinformation, and how anything that Trump said was going to be defined as misinformation on this, blah, blah, blah. You got all of this was dominating all the conversations there, right? And of course, I was coming out against this. So what did they do to me? What do you think they did to me?
I assume they put you in your place.
No, they booted me out as a fellow. They not only did I not, because it's like it should have been sort of automatically renewed at the end of whatever it was, 3 years, right? And everybody else, like Queen Mary, for example, had something like 40 odd of these fellows, okay, and there was me and 4 others in my research group. So it was 5 of us were fellows. Actually, it was 6 of us, right? And I'll tell you about the 6th one in a minute, right? But 5 of us were fellows who did do the automatic reapplication, and basically every single person got accepted with a continued fellowship except us 5. The 6th person, and Casey's listening, he'll probably listen to this, I'll tell him to listen to it, was my colleague Martin Neal, because he actually refused to reapply, and because he was more noble than me. I mean, I should have just told him where to go, right? But we suffered the humiliation of being booted out, whereas he basically cancelled himself. So well done to Martin on that one. But yeah, that's what. And this is what happens. This is British academia for you.
No, it's a crazy world.
It's an absolute joke.
Without getting too personal, I was. I had a case in front of the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Medicine, and I was, I think, singled out and then suspended temporarily. But this temporary suspension went on for years because I didn't see narcotic addiction as a disease. I think it's a trauma. I think it's a bad thing. I don't want to get into my case. I wrote about it recently, and Dr. Robert Malone republished my Substack. It's called Breaking Bad Medicine, based on kind of the Breaking Bad concept. Or I can say it 2 ways. It's either Breaking Bad Medicine version or Breaking Bad Medicine. So I put the pun in there intentionally. But this is back in the pre-woke era, before that word came about in 12 to 14. But I was suspended in 2014, and they kept me in the wilderness for 6 years practically, and they went after me, in a very kind of meretricious way. They gave me a second suspension for nothing, and just to keep me away. And it's a funny thing. It's like, so I think our lives are on the kind of the wrong end of 40, and you have to kind of make your fight. You have to put up your stand, and so I only say this as a way of commending or recommending that you pursue these things, in the field of battle, and because each individual is not strong, but together you can be. I mean, that million or 3 million person president, whatever the number was, they tried to make it 100,000, but the way people congregated in London a couple of weeks ago is indicative of what the power is. The kind of Mark Twainian figure in the U.S., H.L. Mencken, he was a wag and witty, and he said democracy is the principle by which the people vote for what they want, and they deserve to get it, good and hard. Democracy becomes a retribution in the wrong hands, and people will use and then misuse whatever tools are at hand to keep themselves aggrandized and fed and whatnot. And it's just a kind of a perverse system the way it's played out. The UK is essentially the foundation of which American democracy, well, it's not really democracy, but America's Republican form of government existed or came about. And, in that seminal period at, late 18th century, there was the French Revolution and the American Revolution, and almost simultaneously. I think ours came a little bit before. But they become the two threads of how to govern. The American Revolution, the rights are endowed by our creator, and it's something outside of government. And the French Revolution, the creator is the government. And that is the essence of totalitarian thought. I'm sure it predated the French Revolution, other iterations, whatever. But I think that's a really stark example between the American and French Revolution. And they're both, kind of British adjacent. The French were always at war with the Brits. And I think, we became we fought the British, but I think we became really good friends for a long period of time because we had very similar concepts. I just don't know, how those things can be kind of abandoned so thoroughly, and how you can get, I understand that Rishi Sunak was kind of a squish, and Boris Johnson, kind of abdicated and abnegated and abrogated various of his agreements, and he got in on a kind of a second run with almost a landslide to, really do Brexit, whatever. But these kind of quisling politicians, why are they such cowards on the right, and why are they so craven on the left? And getting back to that kind of what I see as a seminal election that you just had that put Keir Starmer in, I understand it was, fractioned certain ways. You may not have gotten that much of the popular vote, but it is an election such as you have for this parliamentary system, such as you have. And whether, that's the best system, I don't know, but that is what you have. This old expression, what is it? What is it? Bite your tongue, cut your nose to spite your face, whatever the expression is. You got rid of Sunak, yay. But then you got something far, far worse. And this goes on for another 4 years at least.
But the problem there is, and this is a continuing problem as well, it's not easily going to go away, is because of the whole repopulation that's taken place in the UK. And we're much worse affected by this than the US, of course. I mean, the US, the major illegal immigration, I guess, comes from South America, whereas here, of course, it comes from countries and mainly in the Middle East and Africa whose cultures are the antithesis of British culture. They hate us, basically, a lot of these people. But the point is that Labour targets either the really radical far left, the sort of the real university freaks. There's, I say, because of the indoctrination, there are quite a lot of those, although interesting enough, whereas Labour's vote used to be their core vote used to be the working class, it's now the educated middle and upper class who've gone through the most extremes of the higher education system. All the PhDs and professors vote Labour, right? That's what they do. So you've got the radical left with the immigrants, in particular the Muslims, right? Although they had a bit of this is going to create a little bit of a problem for them because, of course, at the last election, there were 5 independent MPs got in. We call them the Gaza MPs because they stood solely on the platform that Labour wasn't sufficiently anti-Israel, and therefore they were not going to support Labour, and they managed to take seats. All of those took seats from what were essentially safe Labour seats, incidentally. That problem's going to get worse for Labour, interestingly enough. It will split their votes. So whereas it still got them in last time, and because you've still got an increasing number of these people, unless we tackle the university, let's say that proportion of people who are both radical Marxists and basically Islamists is going to increase. They'll peel away the worst of them, the worst of the Islamists in these new Islamic Gaza parties, but you've still got an increasing proportion. So that, even with all the hatred of Keir Starmer and the Labour government now, it's still a problem, because there's a lot of those people, and they're the most motivated to vote, incidentally, because they're the most obvious beneficiaries of Keir Starmer Labour type government. You need to realise that. That's what, because they're doing the things, they really are doing the things that those people want. Okay, I mean, yeah. So you've got that. I mean, it is a desperate situation. But what you've got to remember about this whole thing about the Conservatives is that the real damage, a lot of this damage, the whole sort of woke ideology, but in particular, the fact that elected officials actually can't do very much, because basically Marxists have been placed into positions in all the institutions, in particular the legal institutions, and the things like all these quangos which do the censorship of radio and TV, for example, Ofcom, or off-communists as we call them. Those are all set in place by Tony Blair, and he's set in place an infrastructure whereby these were appointed but not elected officials, and they were appointed based on his type, that globalist ideology, an extreme left ideology. We can't get rid of those people. So there's a very interesting. I recommend you. I just saw an interview just today. It was released by, do you know Visegrad, that guy, the brilliant guy. He's done an interview with Liz Truss. You should watch that, because she lays out this argument how with the various. I mean, I know David Starkey, the brilliant historian, also talks about this, but she makes it clear from direct experience how, when she was, even for a very short period, the Prime Minister, and when she had senior officers of state in before that, she couldn't do anything. She couldn't do any of the things she wanted to do because they were blocked by these unelected officials in the judiciary and in the civil service. And that was all put in place by Blair. And when Blair, of course, after his reign ended, I mean, he was there, they won 3 elections. But when the Conservatives finally beat them, who was the leader? It was David Cameron, who was effectively more Blairite than Blair himself. He wasn't Conservative in any sense. And of course, he had that coalition, a government coalition with Nick Clegg, who's a hardcore leftist. I mean, he's the guy who was in charge of all the worst censorship of Facebook. Remember, he got appointed to that. And after that, that you then had, then you had Theresa May. I mean, Theresa May came in. She wasn't conservative in any sense whatsoever. She was the one, who really started the hard crackdown on people like, Tommy Robinson, or anybody who was effectively challenging the whole policy of population replacement, because she was very much in favour of that. Boris Johnson only got in and got in with that heavy majority because at that time he was up against Corbyn, who's not only an open, anyway, everybody knows what Corbyn is, but he is an open Marxist socialist, and that was just a bit too much, for the British public to accept. But Boris Johnson did absolutely nothing, and of course completely capitulated to the globalists as soon as COVID came in.
So a couple of questions. First of all, he was brave for 30 seconds and said no lockdowns, and then he caved. But I have a separate question about Keir Starmer, whether he is the same as Corbyn, and whether he's a communist. One of my sons is peripatetic, and he's a digital nomad, and has spent time in the UK, and he says Starmer doesn't run anything like that. He doesn't have anything communist about him. I'm just wondering. So 2 things. I like the second one first. Starmer. I know he spent time in like a camp in Czechoslovakia.
Yeah,
some kind of youth camp, and what's rumor, what's true. There's the Ukrainian rent boys or
Yeah.
all this kind of stuff going on. I mean, that seems to, I don't know. There's these pictures that show up. They're AI generated. There's a lot of stuff that's out there about him. What's true, what's not true. How much is he captured? Does he have a soul? What are his thoughts? How does he govern politically? And is this a communism or just kind of like a blob?
I think he does come from that communist background, and he was the director of public prosecutions or whatever the relevant role is, which basically had a major role in covering up the rape gang, the Islamic rape gang issue in the UK. So he's always had this desire to protect the worst of society, right? Because I don't know. I mean, I think he hates British people, and that's what I think. And if you'd have heard his speech yesterday, he actually said that he basically declared what I consider to be most patriots as being the enemy who he would fight with all means necessary. I think were his words, or words to that effect. So, whether he's being blackmailed by, let's say, globalists who are, let's say, more communist minded than him, I don't know. He could well be. I mean, I know there are people who say that virtually all you only get so far in politics in the UK if you're blackmailable. So there's potentially something in that. And as you say, that the story of the Ukrainian rent boys is very, very strange, and have been all kinds of rumours about Keir Starmer's relationship with that other guy. I can't remember his name. Again, one of these is Muslim funders.
Waleed somebody.
Whatever. So you've got all that. I don't know whether that's true, but I suspect there is some. It wouldn't surprise me if there was some blackmail going on. But if you look at that past and you look at his role when he had those positions within the legal system, it does suggest that he is someone committed to the destruction of British nationalism. Everything fits into that kind of framework. He's a globalist. He was actually asked, of course, this is what gets me. This was long before he was elected. He was asked a straight question by a BBC presenter, someone very sympathetic to him. Emily Maitlis, I think it was, said, the WF Davos or British Parliament, what do you prefer? And he said Davos, because we get things done there.
Yeah, John Kerry said the same thing. They all love that concept. Obama, I think, said something very similar. Could be like China and not have to worry about what the people think. Blah blah blah.
Yeah. So this is the situation we're in. I mean, I don't know. I can't. Just thinking about another manifestation of the academic corruption, this whole cultural Marxism, this whole globalist, anti-Western, in particular anti-Western democracies movement it's all kind of like it's kind of really has coalesced around the whole Palestinianism issue, this obsession with basically putting on a pedestal some of the most evil, violent people the world has ever seen, now turn it into some sort of religion. Palestinianism has become a religion within the UK. As I say, you're not allowed to. As I said, I wasn't joking. I was saying people were getting arrested for posting anti-Hamas memes. That's where we're at. There is no alternative voice in the mainstream media. You have to believe everything that Hamas says or that Qatar tells the.
So are all these people like totally amnesiac of the IRA? I mean, didn't you have your own little two-state solution issue not that long ago. I mean, there's all kinds of separatist movements,
we did, but I mean, I don't like that. I don't think the IRA is a good analogy with Hamas, because the IRA, as evil as they were never determined to kill every Briton living in, in England and Scotland and Northern Ireland. I mean, whereas that's the only thing that will essentially satisfy Hamas is the complete obliteration of all Jews from Israel. That is it, and that's as simple as that. There is no other. There is, that's their argument, and yet nobody seems to be bothered with that.
Yeah. So, there's a professor I listened to. I tried to repost. I don't have his name, but it was some time ago, and he said, "Oh, this is not a land for peace issue. This is not. This is all. The various Arab-Israeli wars are all religious wars." And it's like, what about territory? What about, split capital in Jerusalem? He says, no. Yeah. He said, if tomorrow every Jew converted to Islam, there's no war. That's it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all this stuff is always a religious war. I listened to somebody else who was talking about Islam in general, and he said, you call it a religion, but that's not contextual. What you have in the West, we use that term, whatever that is, are religions where people go to church and they practice certain things, and then they have governments and so forth. Islam is an encompassing, it's a totalitarian aspect where that's every aspect. And if you're in an Islamic country, it's not the religion, that's the law, that's the everything you do. It's in the pool. It's asking like a fish, whether he's half land based. No, you're in the ocean. That's that. It's not. The fish doesn't think about the ocean because he's totally subsumed in it, and that's all he consumes, and whatnot. It's like, in Islam is by this professor is just a way of life. It's not what you're calling religion, like as if it can coexist. It doesn't historically coexist with other religions.
Oh, it can't.
There's some examples where there can be some kind of demi-tax and whatnot, but ultimately it's an expansive supremacist religion and or group, I guess.
Exactly, and we've now got in the UK the Home Secretary, i.e. the person who is responsible for all immigration issues, for example, is this Shabana Mahmood, who was not only one of these Free Palestine freaks, and you can see plenty of images of her with her Free Palestine sign, and she was actually interviewed actually disrupting, going in and destroying sort of Israeli produce in a supermarket, a Sainsbury's supermarket, Birmingham a few years ago. She's now the Home Secretary, and she's openly stated that Islam dominates her entire worldview. For everything she decides and views is around Islam. I mean, she said that, right? And yet she's brought out now because you see her. So the Labour Party's just had its annual conference, right? And of course, as a reaction to the whole Unite the Kingdom rally of Tommy Robinson and the whole British flags things, whereas at every previous Labour conference, the hall has been filled with people waving Palestinian flags. This year, they decided, they'd wave their little Union Jacks and cross of St. George flags as to sort of show, well, we're not really like that. I mean, it's a complete and utter joke. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, there's also what worries me. I mean, this is something I want to get your opinion on as well, because I know you've been you've kind of, I think, have experienced this as well, is that this whole thing with the post-October the 7th love of Palestinianism, when it should have been the death of Palestinianism, it went exactly the opposite way it should have done if there was any logic or reason in the world. The people, a lot of the people driving that were the very people who we were colleagues with during COVID, i.e. the people who were awake to all the lies of the globalists about COVID and climate change and all that stuff. It turns out that those very people who knew, for example, that everything that came from the globalists, from the WF, that came from Qatar, that came from the BBC, that came from the New York Times, that came from Al Jazeera. They knew everything that those people were pumping about COVID and climate change. They knew it was all lies. They knew it was all just a narrative, a globalist narrative. And yet those same people who saw through that were incredibly, 90% of them were the ones who decided to believe everything that exactly those same sources said about Gaza. How do you explain that? Is it just anti-Semitism? I think a lot of it, I've now discovered since, probably is. It's down to anti-Semitism.
It's a mystery to me. I don't understand it. It's not a new concept to have people, I don't know, craven is a word I keep coming up with. But are they idiots or are they just being purchased? It's hard to say. Tucker Carlson.
I think that Tucker Carlson and people like Tucker Carlson now also come out and believed all this, and Candace Owens molested. I mean, Tucker Carlson, there's some real evidence that he's funded by Qatar. But even if he wasn't,
he's been called Tucker Carlson.
And you've got Candace Owens, who
call him Takia Carlson.
The thing about someone like Candace Owens is that she doesn't need to be funded by Qatar. She knows that by coming out with these ridiculous...
So that's the differentiation. But if you go back, to the Walter Duranty story at the New York Times, he was the New York Times man in the USSR. And I don't know if you've seen that movie. Seen the movie Mr. Jones?
I don't think so. No, sorry.
Oh, you should definitely see it. It basically is at the era of the Holodomor, the huge famine in Ukraine. Ukraine was the breadbasket still.
Okay. Well, I know the story, of course. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So Mr. Jones is a Welsh guy, I guess, and he's in I guess he's a newsman of some type, and he winds up in the Soviet, and he meets Walter Duranty, and his life is dissipative. He's having these wild, orgiastic parties, kind of like jazz era parties in Moscow, and living high in the lamp. And he's the guy who's reporting to the world on what is, true about the Soviet Union. And he gives a glowing report and whatnot. And so it's clear, his life is dissolute and destructive and disinformed and so forth. But that's the New York Times window on the world at the time.
Yeah.
Here we have the benefit of having multiple other windows, to understand what Pallywood is, and
They do talk to me. This is what gets me, right? I'll give you an example. I'll name some names here because I've gone into public spats with these people. Take someone like, do you know who Neil Oliver is?
Yeah.
Because he was a very, very powerful voice during COVID. He had his weekly show on GB News. And he would start that show on a Saturday night with his 10-minute monologue about the whole ridiculous, the whole globalists, all the authoritarian nonsense over COVID and vaccines. And people used to really look forward to that. And it was shared by millions, right? Millions of people watched that. And he came across as somebody who was a real deep thinker, a logical guy. And yet as soon as October the 7th happened, he fell straight. I mean, actually, I know some personal reasons why he particularly fell into it, which I won't go on about here, but to give an example of how quickly he turned and how that became his obsession with this non-existent genocide, but calling it, a genocide and blaming basically putting all the blame on the Israelis for everything bad was happening, was so complete that on one of his, in fact, this was not long after October the 7th, he did a monologue where he ended it. I took it up, so I don't want to misquote him. I've got the actual quote here. He said, "It's not manna that falls from heaven onto babies in Gaza, but white phosphorus that burns them to dust." Right? He actually said that. You couldn't get a more obvious bloodline. Now, for a start, white phosphorus, Israel hasn't used that since 2017. And even when it did, it was actually legal in war to use it. So that's neither here nor there. There was absolutely no evidence. Right? In fact, there's all evidence to the contrary. There's been no use of white phosphorus. But the idea that you're using a lie like that with the image that Israel's deliberately burning babies to dust, right? So I was quite friendly. I'd actually been in this program just before October the 7th, and this was just a few weeks after. So I ended up having a long conversation with him about this, and I said, I'm kind of like free speech absolutist, but what you said there in that monologue was demonstrably false, and you, I feel, have a duty to at least point that out next week, that what you said there was demonstrably false and was not backed by any evidence whatsoever. And he point blank refused, and he told me that he was relying on two sources alone: a Palestinian source and an Israeli source. And the Palestinian source, I won't name them here, but people who follow me can probably find this out easily, but his Palestinian source, it was an actual Hamas operative, a known Hamas operative, right, residing in the UK. And his Israeli source was a known ferociously anti-Zionist Jew. And those are his two sources. So he thinks he's getting an Israeli source and a Palestinian source, but he's only getting a ferociously anti-Israel source, an anti-Zionist source of information. But he's convinced himself that's right. And and then he started to say things like all his interest is that nobody should be killed. That's it. He's a pacifist. There should be no deaths. Therefore, all war. The killing has to stop, right? He's never come out and said, well, just release the hostages or anything. None of them have come out and said that. He even said at the time, he told me that, because I said, well, what about, how do you explain why is Yemen, which is like 2,500 miles away from Israel, they've got no border, nothing. Why are they firing missiles at Israel? And why are they blockading, the Straits of Tehran or wherever it is, stopping shipping, getting through on the basis that this is their support for Palestinians? Why are they doing that? And at this point, they'd already killed actually some American sailors, but on ships, stuff like this. And he said, well, no, he thought that was justified resistance on the basis they weren't actually killing anybody, which was even then was demonstrably false. So I mean, just how all these people and so many people who I thought were really good people came out with these most ridiculous. And even, do you know what really gets me is that actually there are people who actually, even till relatively recently, at least weren't coming out with anti-Israel stuff, right? They were kind of like almost sort of, by their silence, they were sort of supportive, because they were actually being targeted by people saying, well, why aren't you coming out against Israel? It must mean you're against the Palestinians. You're a voice in the media. Come out and say something. And the fact they weren't saying anything is kind of like, almost like that sort of quiet admission that they actually understand that it's, Hamas bad, Israel good, rather than the other way around, right? But what got me was that you remember this a few weeks ago, there was this image that the New York Times put out its front page, and all the UK newspapers went with, of that skeletal child, Palestinian child, and they dressed it up that this is Israel starving babies in Gaza, and yet it didn't take even the most minimal of journalistic integrity would have seen that actually the family was actually very well fed, and that actually that child had a congenital muscular disease for which the Israelis had arranged him to be taken from Gaza to Italy for treatments a few months before. But the New York Times put that story out because it was such a dramatic photo. Even though it was actually debunked pretty quickly and very completely, even though that happened, you had days afterwards, I can tell you, there were people who I said who'd have been silent, or even been slightly pro-Israel, were saying, right, that's it, because I've seen that photo, Israel is now the most evil people, I can't support them anymore, this must stop. I mean, can you imagine the mentality of that? They decide their view on world events has to be defined by one fake photo. Even if the photo was actually true, even if you could produce evidence of a skeletal child which had deliberately been denied food, aid from Israel, which of course you can't, because there is no such, you can't provide evidence of that, because masses of aid coming in all the time, and it's only Hamas who's stopping it from getting to everybody who needs it. But even if you could, why would one photo determine who was right and who was wrong. And
No, there's so much
I've
there.
seen this photo. The war must stop now. I've seen this photo. The war, it must stop. Yeah.
Well, if you look at the actual photos like that from an actual genocide, the mother would be starving as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
And everybody else surrounding, they've got loads of obese people. Like you'd have to wonder, like, why, the Gazawis would allow a child to be starving when there's so many obese,
The mother was genuinely obese, as was, I think, a brother. Yeah.
But the other question is, does Russia send food to Ukraine?
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? Israel has to abide by rules that no other nation in the history of any conflict is supposed to abide by.
No, and the European, potent, like these little kind of tyrannical minds, they run wars like crazy. I mean, France has, run all different kinds of wars through Africa.
Yeah.
And and at any given moment, there's lots of other conflicts going on that have higher fatality and mortality rates. There's always something going on in Sudan. There's always something going on in Congo.
It's massive.
And I think 500,000 Christians have been killed in Nigeria.
Yeah.
There's kinds of conflicts that just, it doesn't matter if it's Islam on Islam or Islam on Christian. It only matters if the Jews. It's kind of a weird. There's a line from Fiddler on the Roof. It's like, God, yes, I know we're the chosen people, but for once, why don't you choose somebody else?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really quite depressing, really, because it doesn't seem to be getting any better. I mean, the funny thing is, because you've now got this Trump's 20-point plan, which actually apparently all of the Arab countries and even Pakistan, Indonesia have all accepted, but the only people who haven't yet accepted it is Hamas and the professors at Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge, etc.
No, it's crazy. So does Tony Blair have some role in this thing? I saw his name.
He's supposed to be, yeah, he's going to be the viceroy or whatever of Gaza. I mean, I think that's a joke anyway. I mean, the only thing that will really make the Gazans happy is the destruction of the Jewish state, and until people realise that, nothing's ever going to change.
So my peace plan was this. Actually, there are two like this. One was take the Druze from what's the name of that little place they've got to start with an S. Yeah, Soweto. Take the Druze from Soweto. They're landlocked, and just kind of somehow magically exchange the population with Gaza. So Gaza can have as much Islamist territory as they want up in Syria, and put the Druze in Gaza. They'd have much better geography, be on the Mediterranean, and be able to coexist.
What would the Gazans do in Syria? They'll do what the Palestinians have done in Syria before. They'll attack Israel from there. So
yeah, but
stop them. That's what they do.
They'd have to kind of go in line with a whole bunch of other concurrent Islamist interests. And the other was just to exchange, Dubai or any, fill in the blank Persian. I mean, Persian Gulf is like, they're very wealthy nations there, but they've got a kind of bad, the Persian Gulf is oppressive. It's just a hot, incredibly hellishly hot place. And, switch out Dubai and Gaza, put Dubai there. But
that's essentially, that is Trump's plan, as I understand it.
Right.
That is it. That is, he wants to turn Gaza into another Dubai.
Yeah, why not? I mean, they've got great real estate there. Israel's done really nicely on the Mediterranean. Beautiful.
They're not interested, but this is it. It's, as you say, it's Islam. They're not interested in worldly benefits. That they're interested in, unless the entire world is Islamized, they'll never be happy.
Yeah, and even then they wouldn't be happy.
They certainly don't want a Jewish state in that region. They can't.
Yeah, I mean, even in place, it's not like there's any shortage of wars between Islamist places.
We know that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it would just be another mix of things.
I mean, one thing that would, I guess, help, and it's a shame that the Europeans again are so weak on this, is if that if the Islamic Republic was overthrown, because as most Iranians really want it to be, and it could become, a genuine, decent democracy again, it wouldn't be a threat for the rest of the world. It wouldn't fund all these groups because, it is Iran and Qatar. I mean, okay, you got to do something about Qatar as well, but Iran seems to be particularly malign. And the problem is that it's propped up by the Europeans, and people don't. Again, it's another thing people don't realise. They think, oh, well, it's Russia and China who are propping up Iran. No, it's the Europeans. It's the Europeans who do all the, do so many deals and, entertain them. They still have all of their diplomatic relations and all of that. And it's just, the Europeans have never ever attempted to put any pressure on Iran, even when they take their own civilians hostage. They had a number of German hostages. There's been French hostages, and France, Germany and France don't do anything. They just basically pay them millions of pounds in the end to release them. That's what they do. No punishment whatsoever.
Yeah, and that's a lovely thing. So we're kind of rounding out our hour here.
And a good old rant there, get it off my chest for Yom Kippur. Yeah.
So I hope you have a pleasant fast and wonderful New Year. And
thanks.
Thank you so much for being on the show. Any final words?
No, I mean, thanks for having me on and allowing me to have a bit of a rant like this. I need to get some things off my chest, clearly.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Fenton. I look forward to meeting you finally someday.
Yeah.
We'll have to plan on that. Let me know when you're in the neighborhood here and vice versa.
Yeah, thanks.